Today on Hashtag Lawyer, we're going to be talking about the science of violence. We have Dr. Geoff Desmoulin, the founder of GDC Scientific today, to come talk to us about accident reconstruction, shooting reconstruction, and about all the crazy things he gets to do for a living. Welcome back to Hashtag Lawyer, y'all. We've got myself and Andrea here in studio, and we're lucky to have Dr. Geoff Desmoulin here with us today to talk about the science of violence and about accident reconstruction. Doctor, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so Dr. Desmoulin, he's the founder of GDC Scientific, and he actually is a teacher of a course called The Science of Violence. And Matt's actually going to drop the video in here to let you guys take a look at some of the things that they do over here at GDC Scientific.
The Science of Violence is an online course created by renowned expert in biomechanics, Geoff Desmoulin, and the team at GTD Scientific.
At GTD, we developed unique strategies to find out what really happened during violent encounters. The Science of Violence course allows us to share some of these skills and help legal professionals, law enforcement, scientists, engineers, and medical professionals understand how biomechanical engineering can provide definite answers when the truth is hard to find.
With 4 degrees in science and biomechanical engineering, more than 30 published scientific research papers, and a background as a paramedic and military officer, Desmoulin is uniquely skilled at applying the laws of physics to solve accidents, stabbings, shootings, explosions, and a host of other violent encounters.
At GTD, we use awesome technology, but the key element is the approach used when solving real-world problems, especially when there are multiple and conflicting versions of events. That's why I wanted everything in the Science of Violence course to be anchored by actual cases and scientific studies. Participants can understand the science, appreciate the methods, and see the results.
The Science of Violence course is modular so that participants can tailor their experience and the takeaway to their needs. It starts with an introduction to biomechanics and an overview of GTD methods and tactics. And it continues with deeper dives into areas such as photogrammetry, modeling, testing, free body diagrams, reconstruction, and replication.
The Science of Violence course will improve your approach to investigations, resources, and expert witnesses. Initially, these events were mysteries, but by applying science, we were able to help our clients make their case in court. I hope you can join me for the Science of Violence.
So, Doctor, tell us a little bit about, I want to kind of introduce you to the audience. Tell us a little bit about your background, and then I want to get into how you got into this field, because it's a pretty cool story.
Yeah, it is actually. My background was really just a culmination of my interest over time. I actually started my career as a firefighter, and firefighter EMT actually. Mm-hmm. So the firefighter part of that aspect dealt with engineering principles like pump pressures, heat transfer, things of that nature. But then the EMT aspect of that dealt with the human body in injury. And so that combination is really what just forged the path for me. There was a circumstance had it that I couldn't continue as a firefighter, so I went back to university. And biomechanics was really the only thing that kind of fueled that fire, if you will, that combination of engineering and bioscience, if you will. And I'm finding that combination is really the magic behind what we do. And it gives us unique insight into situations where a typical investigation tends to miss things, or I should say, it adds information that wasn't necessarily there before.
Okay. And you did create this company, GDC Scientific, right?
I did, yeah. And that's an interesting story too, actually. It goes way back to the days of Deadliest Warrior, where I met the showrunner, Tim Prokop. Amazing guy, amazing showrunner. But the story goes is after 1,500 people, he was the guy that said, this is him. This is who we need. And I literally got a call in the cadaver lab one day at Wayne State University. And somebody said, somebody from Hollywood wants to talk to you. And I just thought they were joking, to be honest. And I might have been in trouble or whatever. Went up to my supervisor's office.
Dun, dun, dun.
And sure enough, Tim Prokop was on the phone. And he asked me a few questions, asked me to put a reel tape together. And then at the end of the conversation, he says, by the way, at the end of this reel tape, could you give an analysis of a fight to the death between a Spartan and a ninja? And I kind of got warm fuzzies after he asked me that question. And I was like, this is something I can do. And so I sent that tape in, and the rest is history, so to speak. So literally after the first show aired, and I believe it was Apache versus Gladiator, literally after that first show aired, I started getting phone calls. And so I went from this student, a PhD student that happened to find himself on a television show, to somebody who was in fairly high demand for consulting. And I had to do something about it. And I didn't really know what to do, to be honest. And so I went and saw an accountant, and they said, okay, well, we're going to run all this through a company. You're now going to own a company. And that's literally how GTD was born.
That's awesome. Well, and I know on our pre-production call, I was talking to you about the fact that I used to watch Deadliest Warrior. My brother watched it pretty religiously, so he'd probably be able to talk about the show a little bit more than me.
Yeah, so I'm going to interrupt here, Austin. So for those of us who tend to watch Kardashians, Housewives of Salt Lake City, maybe Pretty Little Liars here and there, I mean, what is the quick and dirty on Deadliest Warrior? I think I have an idea, but for the rest of the audience, like me, who don't watch this, what is it?
Who don't have sparkly shoes on their desktop?
I know, doesn't everyone?
So basically what it was, the premise of the show was that we took warriors that actually existed in history, but never met on the battlefield. And then we had a hypothetical battle to the death on our show. So my job was to look at the effectiveness of the weapons, the engineering aspects. We had an emergency physician, Dr. Armand Dorian, who I think you should have on your show, to be honest. He's an amazing guy. He's up to amazing things, who would give us the medical history and the medical aspect of the show. And then we had Max Geiger, who is a game designer, and he was the IT expert on the show that would run the simulator. And then, you know, based on those tests and all the information that we collected throughout the show, it would all culminate in this battle to the death at the end of the show, where the simulator would tell us who would have won hypothetically.
Mm-hmm. And if I remember correctly, a lot of the analysis and things that you would talk about to the audience were, okay, if this weapon versus this armor, how would the blow affect the person getting hit, you know, all those types of things.
So I have a question.
Well, absolutely.
I just finished reading Blood and Thunder, which was a Kit Carson biography, and you know, a lot of it, right, is like the expansion of the American West and Manifest Destiny and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of battles and interactions between the, you know, United States military and various different Native American tribes. Mm. And so I was like, that has to be rough, right? You know, you have bows and arrows and then guns.
Right.
So did you ever have a situation where you were very surprised by the outcome? For example, maybe someone had a gun, but someone with a apparently less evolved weapon was actually able to win?
You know, that's a great question. I think there was only one mismatch on the show, and that was Maori warrior versus the Shaolin monk, because the Maori warrior literally had sticks and stones, and the Shaolin monk had forged weapons. So that was probably our only mismatch. We were very careful not to go gun versus knife, but there was several surprises. And the one that I thought was the biggest surprise, or the biggest flop, if you will, was the ball and chain of William Wallace. Because we've all seen Braveheart, and we love that scene where he's on his horse, he jumps on the bed, and he crushes the guy's skull with the ball and chain. And that was just an amazing scene.
Right.
But you think it's this, amazingly effective weapon that's easy to wield based on that scene, when in fact Hollywood has sold us a lie. Surprise, surprise. And what we found out was that weapon was very hard to wield, and it was more of a rank spreader, if you will. Had zero accuracy. It was very hard to wield. It took a lot of effort. Wasn't very accurate. But if it did hit, it could do some damage. And so the way we kind of held out that weapon was it was going to be more of a rank breaker than an individual versus individual weapon. And so, yeah, that was the biggest surprise for me. And there was others vice versa as well.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So obviously you started doing consulting work. You started with GDT Scientific. And just for our audience, can you kind of explain what it is that GDT Scientific is in the business of doing?
Sure. GTD, our core competency is biomechanics. As I said previously, it really stems from this mastering two disciplines. And I know that's a lot to say, but that's really what it takes. Is you have the engineering side, who is good at machine dynamics, physics, mathematics, things of that nature, and then you have the medical professional, who is trained to diagnose and treat so that you can maximize that prognosis moving forward in time. So essentially, their training starts at the time of the injury moving forward in time, where what we do is we'll start at the same point as the physician, but then using the tools of the engineer, work backwards in time to figure out what happened to actually cause that injury. And when you can describe how an injury happened, if you can describe the accelerations, the forces, the pressures, the direction to make that tissue fail, you actually know a lot more about that incident than probably, I want to say 95% of the investigators that are on there. I know that's that I don't want to toot our own horn, but this is what we're finding. In fact, just this week, I've got a call with the South Australian Police Department because they've got a high-profile murder on their case, on their file, on their plate, and they called us. And there's a lot of people between Vancouver, British Columbia, and South Australia. So this is what we're finding, and it adds. Although it's still a team environment, I think we add a unique perspective that allows people to solve files that they wouldn't necessarily have done without using biomechanics. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
So would you be useful, do you think, on a cold case?
Absolutely. There's a good example of that is out of Pennsylvania. If you Google Holtzlander is the file, and he was someone who admitted to killing someone. However, he claimed it was self-defense, and what he was saying was semi-plausible. And so this was a cold case that, to be honest, I don't want to get too much into the arrest and the whole process there, because I'm not familiar with that. But I do believe that this was something that they were having difficult convicting, and someone had tipped them off. I believe it was Force Science, and we work a lot with Force Science. That's over with Dr. Bill Lewinsky there. They recommended us to take a look at what this person was saying and see if the biomechanics really worked. And so really what we're saying here is we're taking something qualitative, which is just somebody's description of something, how it happened, and then using biomechanics to quantify it. So basically we place numbers to that narrative. And as we get into our case study of Victor Ortega later on in this podcast, you'll see how applying numbers to a narrative can really tell you whether or not that narrative was most likely or not. Yeah.
And so, we talked a little bit before. You get hired, obviously, to help investigations. You get hired to help lawyers when they're putting together their cases for trial. From our discussion before, it sounds like there's a lot of work that you do in the personal injury world and then also in the criminal world as well when it comes to shootings and things like that. Can you kind of discuss the division of labor, so to speak, within the company when it comes to those different areas?
Right now, it's probably about 80% police use of force or a criminal homicide, and about 20% accident reconstruction. But the core competency remains the same. We simply describe how the injury occurred using biomechanics. And from there, it really creates a framework around the narratives that are being told, and it fits with the rest of the evidence that allows us to tell the story most accurately, I believe.
Now, with that, do you have a favorite type of case that you guys work on? Like, do you personally love doing gunshot type of situations, explosions? Like, what's your favorite?
It's funny. They're all enjoyable. I'm not gonna lie about that. The police work is also interesting. There's, we talk about the CSI effect. I'm actually affected by it too. I think it's just cool to work with police departments and having that level of case file come in. That to me is really quite interesting. When they could be choosing other people and they choose us, that to me just I feel this sense of responsibility. But at the same time, you have to be completely objective as to what you're doing, and that to me is where most experts go wrong. Is they either actually, number one mistake for experts is they go outside of their box of expertise, and then the second is they want to please the client. And so we're careful to do both, and we're probably too conservative. I could probably take on more work than I do, but I tend to turn away about 10 to 30% of work that comes in because of those reasons. And but yeah, it's about an 80-20 split right now. And my most favorite is probably the police related work.
Well, I know on the pre-production call we talked about CSI, so I want to let you dive into this one.
Okay, so I mean, who doesn't love CSI, right? So, but we see what CSI looks like in TV shows. We see like detective shows, and they do CSI fancy stuff, and all of a sudden, boom, they find out the answer. And I'm like, how did you learn this from looking at I'm so confused. How did you arrive? So, what is CSI like in real life versus CSI on a TV show? How are you impacted by CSI? How do you interact with it? That was a compound question, so take your pick of where you want to start.
Well, that's okay, because I'm a bit of a rambler, so I'm pretty sure I can cover it in my long answer here. But I have to say that we are constantly dealing with what we call the CSI effect. So this television show has literally raised the expectations of society. And that means judges, juries, lawyers, experts, and you really need to deal with that because it's real. And so what ends up happening with us is that we're either combating it or trying to meet those expectations. And I'll tell you what that means. And so when we're working up a file and there might be a report, for example, that has imagery in it, and we're constantly we're trying to communicate complex engineering principles to the layer. And in doing that, visualization is very effective. And if there's an opportunity to go from a 2D image to a 3D image to do that, we'll always opt for the 3D image. Why? Because of CSI effect. That is the expectation. So we're trying to raise the bar, if you will, with respect to what people want to see. But at the same time, we try to manage expectations by saying, look, this is something, here's the extra resources it's going to take to go from 2D to 3D. And is that worth it for you? Or another way is to perhaps wait and just, here's our report, deal with that first. We can come up with a demonstrative should it go to trial, and that demonstrative will be more in line with the CSI effect. So stuff like that we're dealing with all the time, and even internally, there's this belief that there's this technique. I don't know if you're aware, but there's this technique called inverse photogrammetry. When you have a three-dimensional scan of a scene, and you have a body-worn camera footage or a cell phone footage within that scene, you can place that camera or that body-worn camera within the scene fairly accurately. But sometimes things are happening so fast with that camera capture system, whether it's a cell phone or a body-worn camera, that you can't get clear images enough to place where it is in space. And I'll have people here make a suggestion in a meeting, goes, we'll just inverse photogrammetry that, and we'll know exactly where that camera was. And because we know where the camera is, then we know where that person is. And it's not always that easy. And it's not always the best answer to go to the most fanciest, most complex answer. And so if we hit that roadblock, then we have to go around it. And if we're going around it, that usually means more simple and less CSI effect techniques. But having said that, now I should say that it's typically the most simple answer that will give you the most accurate and the most effective answer.
Yeah.
KISS, right? Keep it simple, sweetie.
Yeah.
I learned that in like 8th grade.
Well, and some of this stuff, Doctor, you talked to us a little bit about this. Some of this goes into some of the advice and training you actually give to police force prior to them going on an investigation. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that to our audience?
Yeah, we have a course called The Science of Violence, and it starts out with very fundamental information. But the whole goal of this course is to give them real skills that they can use today. And so when we're talking about before they go out on a shift, for example, we talk about how effective that the tools they're carrying can actually be in our investigation 6 months or a year down the road. So, for example, a cell phone. We'll teach police officers how to take images of the scene, but more importantly, and I can't tell you how many times this is missed, is a photograph of the injury itself. All too often, we will get the medical report that has a general description of the injury, but no images. Mm-hmm. And so when a physician tries to do a mechanism of injury, it's usually in a box about the size of my thumb, and it'll say something like fall from a ladder or motor vehicle accident or gunshot wound, something like that. It's very indescript. Unless the person's deceased, then it goes to a medical examiner and they document those injuries very, very well. But if the person survives, we find that things like bruises or abrasions get missed because they're ignored for the sake of the more serious injuries, which makes sense as if you're a medical professional.
Sure.
But as an investigator, it means that we've lost information. We've lost information with how that person was moving in space, their orientation at the time of the incident, contact with various objects within the scene. Mm-hmm. And all this is excellent information that we can use to piece it together afterwards. So we're saying, look, take out your cell phone, document things, put it on video mode, move up and down an object. If there's an object of interest, move up and down with your cell phone during filming, nice and slow, full circle, and we can now create a three-dimensional model based on that cell phone video. I can't tell you how many times we receive a file and how helpful that one cell phone photo or that one cell phone video actually was to an investigation when we get that full complement of materials. Because they're the first one on scene, and it's the evidence starts to degrade from there. So let's document it.
Sure. Well, you mentioned the Victor Ortega case study earlier, so I wanted to go ahead and jump right in with this. And just for our listeners, this is a case that Dr. Desmoulin wanted to talk about today because he's going to give us a chance to kind of explore the GDT scientific method and everything. So, Doctor, you just give us a little background, kind of set this up factually, and then we can jump into your analysis on it.
Sure. The background on this file is very contentious for the city of San Diego. Actually, there was rioting in the street, demonstrations for weeks on end on this file. And the belief was there was 2 audio witnesses. Okay, so no one actually saw this event happen except for the police officer and Victor Ortega himself. And the 2 audio witnesses claimed they heard handcuffs and then 2 shots. Okay, so the belief from that point was that this person was restrained and then executed. Okay,
by a police officer, right?
By a police officer, exactly. So it was a very high-profile case, and the 2 audio witnesses weren't incorrect. They did hear the handcuffs, and they did hear 2 shots in rapid succession. Now, the issue from there became, well, what information do we work off on this file? When you don't have a body-worn camera footage, when you don't have security surveillance, you don't have cell phone footage, all you've got is an officer's statement. What do you do? So we followed the scientific method, which is we treat that statement as hypothesis. Okay, so in science, you test against that hypothesis, and if you can't reject it, then in essence, you must accept it. Okay, and that's what we did. So we laid out his narrative exactly as is, and then we started quantifying that using biomechanics. So we put together a reenactment with video and various angles, and we were able to, based on his statements, reenact the incident and then start taking measurements from that video. And then those measurements led to other measurements such as ballistics testing. So, for example, we had 2 wound paths in Victor Ortega. One was near the navel, ended up in the buttock, and then the other one was in the back of the neck that ended up in the diaphragm. And just to, that was another.
Just to be clear here, Doc, I was going to ask you if I remember reading correctly on the report. I believe that the story that the officer said is that he was trying to wrestle Ortega to the ground. Ortega, was he the one, the deceased?
Yes.
Okay, so he's trying to wrestle Ortega to the ground, and his statement was that I think his backup revolver or backup weapon ended up on the ground near Ortega, and then that's maybe what led to the shooting. I'm reading that correctly?
Yeah, that was one of the red herrings in this particular file, in the sense that he's wrestling with Victor, he's trying to get him under control, and there is one witness that sees this struggle from afar through some trees across a parking lot, and the one thing that they could discern was one officer or one person looked like an officer, and they felt that officer was losing the struggle. And so what was said in statements was that the officer was on top of Victor Ortega trying to get hand restraints on, and he was going to deploy his taser when he realized that his backup revolver was above and to the right of Victor Ortega's head. And so to prevent Victor from reaching for it, and I believe he stated that he did at one point, that he had to kind of disengage Victor to kind of swat it away. So that was one thing. But in doing that, Victor was able to kind of roll out of the current position he was in, get to one knee, and started to lunge towards the primary sidearm of the officer. And that's when he drew his weapon and fired 2 shots in rapid succession. So that was the key moment where people were saying, well, was he executed or was he lunging for the primary firearm and then fired 2 rounds? And so at first look, because of these 2 very different wound paths, one in the back of the neck ending up in the diaphragm, the other one in the navel ending up in the buttock, it would seem that they were not in rapid succession, and perhaps the back of the neck was more of an execution style shot after the restraints were put on. But what we did is we tested against that, okay? And we took information from the shooting range. So we wanted to know, because of these two very different angles of wound path trajectory, we wanted to know what the typical bullet spread was, or change in trajectory, between two shots in rapid succession with a semi-automatic pistol held in one hand and a bent arm, because that's how he said he shot. And what we found was, on average, that the second shot was above and to the left of the first shot. Okay, and that became very, very important. And that was something that we didn't know. Second of all, we were using a biomechanics model called MATIMO. And MATIMO stands for Mathematical Dynamics Modeling. And what it is and I think you can see some clips of that in the Science of Violence video that I showed you. You'll see like a humanoid that looks like it's made of a bunch of spheres. But those spheres are made up of masses and contact characteristics, okay? So you can create 9.81 meters per squared, which is gravity of Earth. Right. You can create that in an environment. You can create asphalt with the proper coefficient of friction, which is basically the friction between skin and asphalt. And that became very important because Victor had various abrasions on his forehead that no one could explain based on the narrative. And we couldn't figure it out either until we ran the model. And so I don't want to make a long story short. It deserves a read. This is published in two places. One is in Force Science News. That's the kind of the user-friendly version where we don't use so many scientific terms. But we've also published this in the International Journal of Forensic Engineering. And I encourage your audience to go there and have a read if they want the more detailed version. Because there were probably 7 pieces of evidence that we're able to put together that were independent, including shot-to-shot interval, by the way. And the shot-to-shot interval with a semi-automatic pistol ranges between 1/4 of a second and 1/3 of a second, okay? And what we found was somebody falling forward or lunging forward towards the where the officer said his primary weapon was located. We can get a shot in the navel, ending up in the buttock, and another one in the back of the neck, ending up in the diaphragm, just from someone kind of lunging forward with the torso flexed in that manner. And that was something that, that's something that just, you couldn't have preemptively decided that. Right. It was something where all of these pieces of evidence came together. And that is, I think, the magic of our process. This is something we just published in the Trial Lawyers Association of British Columbia magazine called The Verdict. And so if anyone's interested in that, they can go there. It's the summer version 2021. Again, that's a user-friendly version of the process. We're in the middle of getting the more complex version of the process published. We want to get this stuff out there. Yeah. We shouldn't be the only ones using this, but I think that the key point there is the feedback loop. So we have a process that always starts at the injury, and then we work our way down a reconstruction until we get to the discussion. And then at that point, we kind of step back and we say, does this fit the independent information available to us? So that means case information. That means any video that's available. That means any previous studies that were published. And this is stuff that you can't plan. Right. It's just, it is or it isn't. And if it isn't, you've missed something. And you have to go back to the drawing board because something in your analysis is incorrect, or something that you're assuming is incorrect. Yeah. However, if you've got several pieces of independent information that fit that narrative, then you can start making educated conclusions. Because as you know, we work under different premises. There's the balance of probabilities in civil trials, and there's the beyond a reasonable doubt in criminal trials. And from a researcher standpoint, I see that as balance of probabilities is anything greater than 50%, which is actually a fairly easy window to hit. And I think that's where experts go wrong. They end up just saying almost anything under the sun. And they say, believe me, because I have these credentials behind my name. And it's awful. But in a criminal trial, beyond a reasonable doubt to me is 95% confidence. And that's a research level of confidence. And so you're being asked to really come up with a research level experiment with research level results there, because we're trying to protect against type 1 errors. Obviously, we don't want to send an innocent person to jail. But having said that, the resources for criminal trials are always less than civil trials, which I always found bizarre. And I have to explain that to potential clients, where we're going to be spending more time, more resources on criminal files than we are civil, but they end up needing it to cost less. So anyways, that's just an aside. Yeah. But that's basically it in a nutshell. And is there any other questions you had about the Ortega file?
Well, so did that one actually go to trial?
It did.
Okay.
Hang on. Did it? I got somebody down in San Diego. Yes, it did.
Okay.
And so deposition was, I believe, 2016. Trial was, I believe, 2017. Mm-hmm. They had a trial attorney that was a former city attorney for the city of San Diego. Very, very skilled individual. And but again, the beauty of my work is I don't have to be an advocate, and I just state the facts. And the facts were that the narrative of the police officer couldn't be rejected. And because we couldn't reject it, it had to be accepted within a reasonable means. And, explaining that to him, he had difficulty understanding that. But at the end of the day, there was nothing he could ask me that would change the jury's mind. And so at the end, he was the officer was exonerated. But obviously, a very scary thing to go through as a police officer.
Sure.
I believe that we have excellent selection criteria. I think that nobody starts a shift wanting to murder somebody. It's just, there are definitely mistakes that happen out there. I don't believe this was one of them. And it's my advice to the public is listen first, complain later. And I know that people are having very bad days, and what ends up happening is they just make one bad decision after another, and then an officer's forced to make a decision himself. So listen first, complain later is my advice for people out there. It's not a perfect system. We're constantly trying to improve it, but I believe that the men and women in blue have the most toughest job out there, and to make these decisions under the time crunch that they have, and seeing what happens to them on the opposite side that rarely gets the same media coverage is abhorrent. I can think of countless posts that I see on LinkedIn of officers passing, of incidents where they're giving zero warning and both officers are shot, one of them killed. It's just, it is a tough job. And to make those decisions under those circumstances is, a job that requires amazing restraint. And I do have nothing but support for them.
Yeah. Well, and you've had the opportunity to do a lot of work alongside cases like the Victor Ortega case, at least from discussing with you. So you get to see some of this firsthand. And I do think it's pretty awesome that you're able to combine all these areas of expertise like you're talking about to be able to look at that narrative and compare it backwards. So Dr. Desmoulin, we really appreciate you being on today. Is, any last parting thoughts you want to leave our listeners with about the science of violence, about GDT, about anything that you guys do?
Or Deadliest Warrior.
I guess one thing I do want to say is I might sound like I'm pro-police, but one thing that I'm very adamant about is I'm a scientist first, and everything we do is 100% objective. And we work for plaintiff files as well. I get handwritten letters from people who have found themselves in jail, and I'm more than happy to help them if I think I can. And it's just a matter of being unbiased, objective, and get to the truth. When violence happens and fingers are pointed, our job is to find the truth, and then the lawyers can battle it out, as you know.
Hey, that's a great little clip right there. I like that.
There we go.
I like that. That works out great. Well, Doctor, thank you so much for being on today. We really enjoyed talking to you about GDT Scientific and about the science of violence and about everything that you guys do over there.
Likewise, thank you so much, and enjoy the sunny day in Texas.
Thank you.
That's
Take
it
care.
for today on #Lawyer Guys. Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned for closing arguments, and go check out the science of violence video that we have here posted.
Hey y'all, don't go. We have closing arguments coming up for you in just a second. But before you listen, make sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast if you got any value from today's episode. And please share the podcast with others. And if you want to interact with Austin or me, or tell us what you want to hear next, you can find me on Instagram at andrea.s.turner, Austin at The Dallas Lawyer spelled out, or the podcast #Lawyered spelled out. Look forward to hearing from you.
The U.S. Senate confirmed Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to an appellate bench seat, now placing her one step closer to a possible U.S. Supreme Court nomination. Justice Jackson will now sit in the D.C. Circuit, the appellate bench for the District of Columbia, and she's a President Biden nominee. She's a Washington-based U.S. District Judge, and she's what most think is President Biden fulfilling his promise to nominate a black woman to the U.S. Supreme Court. If Justice Breyer steps aside, we may now have a preview to his successor.